Scott, as our audience might have seen, this whole film was based on a Vanity Fair article with one of the best headlines ever, Rorschach and Awe, that was about the two CIA investigators and interrogators. Can you tell me a little bit about what in that article stood out to you, and at what point you realized the story really needed to pivot and become about Dan Jones instead?
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming. When I started, I was sort of drawn to these two psychologists, in large part because both of my parents were psychologists, and it was somewhat stunning to me to think about the idea that someone would weaponize psychology, and there was no science to back up the idea that you could do these techniques to extract the truth out of people. I started my research, and then the report that Dan Jones wrote for the Senate Intelligence Committee came out, and I started poring over the report with Jennifer, and then I was able to meet Daniel Jones, and I went out to dinner with him. And obviously, he can't tell me anything that isn't in that report. So at some point, I said to him, "Tell me the story of how you told the story." And I became really intrigued by the process he had to go through. And it seemed to me to be more interesting to write a story about a truth teller than about, two guys who basically ripped us off.
Jennifer, can you talk about the timing of all of this? Because you're trying to get this film made, and meanwhile, history is also unfolding.
Yeah, when we started working on the project 5 years ago, Obama was still in office and the torture program was over. And at that point, we felt an urgent need to tell the story so that history didn't repeat itself and to try and have a truth told. And as we went through the process, it just became more and more and more relevant by the day. And then on the campaign trail, we have a presidential candidate saying he would bring back torture or worse. And at that point, it just became incredibly apparent to us that there was an extremely urgent need. But then it continued on through, as we have been witnessing in real time now, the need for checks and balances. And we hope that the film will shed some light on the importance of that.
Adam, you also got to spend some time with the real Dan Jones. What are some of the things that struck out the most to you about him as a human being?
His sense of decorum as a Senate staffer, which I related to, that there's definitely a chain of command that he has to follow. He couldn't just, he didn't know it was going to be that long when he started doing his job, but it's not his responsibility to go into the higher-ups office and basically demand that he be heard and give his opinion about give his opinion, period. It was to present fact and let the facts speak for himself. And even his faith, in spite of what he was uncovering within the checks and balances in those institutions, are still very strong. He still, as it is in the movie, there is a way that he can go a fast track to getting the information out, but he still has faith in this. And I think that Scott's script does a good job of showing that it isn't the institutions overall. It's really a question of people in positions of power and leadership and accountability. It's not an indictment of the CIA overall, because people within the CIA obviously spoke out against the program. So he has a very level head and methodical approach to work, and maybe could be characterized as obsessive, but you kind of always hope that kind of personality is in those rooms, isolated, especially obviously in government, following a moral code, presenting fact as opposed to opinion.
And Jon Hamm, what's fascinating to me about this film is I feel like we live in a culture where you're either right or you're wrong, and people see things and they see things that one way, and it's hard to see things any other way. And yet, Mr. McDonough's a little bit more in between. I feel like I'm just curious your approach in playing this film, especially when it came to good guy, bad guy, how he might be portrayed.
Yeah, I think we're sort of indoctrinated at this point in the political landscape to feel like everything is one opposite or the other polar opposite, and the reality is most functional politics takes place in between. And as my character in the movie says, politics is messy, and democracy is messy. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. You know, one of the things I'm most proud about being in this film is that this is an example of government being applied correctly and working. It's not perfect, but the truth did come out, a version of it. And Dennis's job was to massage that truth out, to get it out in the most fair, effective way. If he would have just stomped his foot, said, no, we're right, it's going to come out this way, the other side would have pushed back and they would have got nowhere. So he realized there had to be a give and take, there had to be some negotiation there. And that's 95% of politics. And that's the way it's designed. And it's what we're going through right now is a version of that, the system doing what, working by the directions that they set down on a piece of paper, 200 and some odd years ago. So that's what I think is interesting about Dennis is that he knows that the pendulum swings, and he knows that this administration is only going to last 4, maybe 8 years, and so.
But he wants to work a much longer period of time.
You get as much done as you can in the time that you have.
One thing that was not in the script originally, as I understand it, was the torture scenes. Can you talk about the decisions there, Scott, to actually include that? And then once you did decide to include that, how you wanted to shoot those particular scenes? They're difficult to watch.
Yeah, I mean, initially I didn't want to include them at all because I was worried that it would take people out of the movie. And then I had a conversation when I was doing my research with a guy named Alberto Mora, and he was the Navy's general counsel when the program was on, worked in the Pentagon. And Alberto, when he found out what was going on, really stood up and tried to stop it. He is a real hero in this story. And when I interviewed him, he asked me the exact same question you're asking now and said, how are you going to handle that? And I said, I don't know. I don't really want to tip over the experience for the audience by overwhelming them with torture. And he said, if you don't show it, aren't you doing exactly what the CIA did when they destroyed the tapes? And as painful as it is, I think it's important that, a lot of what went on here was about language. Enhanced interrogation, EIT sounds like something like a drop of Retsin or something like that. And it's torture. That's why we have that word. And a word like waterboarding is a word, but when you see what that really means to a human being, that's a very different experience. And we work in a visual medium, and we have to understand what really went on here. Yeah. So I guess I felt like if I didn't do it, I was compounding sort of the original sin here. And and once I decided to do it, I also really was struck by John McCain's speech, which closes the film, which is, it's about us, not about them. So when Greg O'Brien and I started editing the movie, I was like, for every 2 shots of someone being tortured, or every shot of someone being tortured, let's try and have 2 shots of the torturers. And make it clear that the people who are doing this were doing it with masks on. And I just find it fascinating that you think you're serving justice, but you have to do it with a ski mask on.
And that was probably the thing that we spent the most time on in post-production, really finding just the right balance where we weren't gratuitous, but we also felt like we were serving the truth. And when you look at it very closely, you'll notice that what you see is a foot shaking, water dripping on the ground, sound, that we're telling a lot of the story without very directly showing what it is, and it's still pretty terrifying.
My thanks to Jon Hamm, Adam Driver, Jennifer Fox, and Scott Z. Burns.